The day I walked into a county hearing room holding a single folder that could decide whether an entire luxury subdivision kept their precious golf carts and manicured trails or lost the legal ground under their designer mailboxes, I remember catching the stunned look on Charlotte Whitmore's face, the queen of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, when she finally realized I wasn't just some stubborn rancher clinging to old fences and a sagging barn. I was also senior grant officer at the State Land Resources Division, the very guy whose signature decided whether their land grant lived or quietly died. But that, like every good mess, started somewhere a lot smaller, a lot more personal. In my case, with 15 dusty acres and a letter written in my father's shaky handwriting, telling me that Cole Ranch was mine now, that the old barn, the weathered orchard, and the little sacred spring tucked back behind the cottonwoods were all that was left of a legacy my family had guarded since before anyone had ever heard the words HOA or planned community. The ranch sat like an island of history on the edge of Red Hawk County, a rectangle of grass and weather and memory hemmed in on three sides by the shiny new roofs and stone columns of Maple Ridge Estates. One of those premier living communities with a gated entrance, matching mailboxes, and a glossy brochure that promised tranquility while hiding a hunger for every square inch of land around it. And from the day I signed the probate papers, I knew two things: that my father had died still, fighting the same people who'd been trying to swallow our ranch since the 70s, and that I was not built to walk away from that fight. Charlotte Whitmore showed up on my gravel driveway 2 days after I moved into the ranch house. White SUV, pearl earrings, clipboard cradled like a weapon, introducing herself as president of the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, and she smiled in that way people do. When they're certain you're already a problem, they know exactly how to handle. She told me there had been a boundary adjustment a few years back, that the ranch now fell within the community footprint, and that, as a courtesy, she'd brought me a welcome packet and a list of minor compliance issues I'd want to address to keep things harmonious. And I remember feeling the heat rise in my chest as I told her, politely at first, that the ranch deed explicitly exempted us from any HOA, that I had the recorded plat and exemption documents in a safe inside, and that this land had stood long before Maple Ridge was a marketing concept. Her smile didn't even flicker when she slid her stack of papers onto my tailgate. Violation notices already filled out in neat cursive, one for my old rural mailbox that didn't match their glossy black posts, one for my tractor park where it could be seen from the road, one calling my 100-year-old barn aesthetic liability, another referencing a watershed impact fee for the spring I'd grown up believing was sacred, fed by stories about the tribal elders who once used it for ceremony. And as the list went on, my patience snapped, and I told her point blank that Cole Ranch was not under her jurisdiction, that she could send as many pieces of paper as she wanted, but the law was on my side. That was when Mark and Emily Carter, my only real neighbors not living behind a gate, quietly stepped in my life. Mark, a retired lineman with shoulders like fence posts, Emily, a former teacher with the kind of soft voice that still somehow carried steel. They invited me over for coffee that night and slid a USB drive across the table. On it, a recording from a recent Maple Ridge board meeting. Charlotte's voice crisp and clear, she talked about how Cole Ranch was the last obstacle to full control of the watershed, how the sacred spring sat on what she called prime amenity space, and how her father, decades earlier, had nearly closed the deal until a judge sided with my grandfather and ruled the ranch forever excluded from any HOA authority. You could hear the bitterness in her voice, like the case had never really ended, just waited for the next generation to pick it up. From that moment, the paper war became a siege, violation letters landing in my mailbox almost weekly, Maple Ridge landscaping crews accidentally cutting my fence line while maintaining community edges, orange flags showing up on my pasture, marking some imaginary boundary they'd drawn over my deed, notices about emergency environmental measures claiming my cattle access road was damaging soil stability and had to be blocked with barriers they'd already ordered, and each new document came with a fresh threat: $5,000 in fees here, talk of liens, and foreclosure proceedings there, all of it framed as inevitable, as if the law were just a script they'd already written for my life. I'd show up to my day job in a press shirt and tie at the State Land Resources Division, spend my hours reviewing conservation easements and grant renewals for projects all over the state, then come home, trade the tie for worn denim, and walk a property that people like Charlotte saw only as a future park, a marketing bullet point, a trophy their fathers had failed to take, and I'd feel this strange double-life tension building inside me. Because while they thought I was just some stubborn holdout with a sentimental attachment to an old barn, I knew exactly how fragile the paperwork under Maple Ridge Estates really was. They just didn't know I knew it yet. The night the barn burned, I smelled it before I saw it, that thick, oily smoke cutting through the cool air, and when I crested the little rise behind the ranch house and saw the roofline of the old structure outlined in orange, the flames already licking through the slats of what my great-grandfather had hammered in by hand, I swear for a moment time folded in on itself, and I could hear his voice, my father's laughter. The quiet stories my mother used to tell under those rafters, all of it, being shredded by heat and bad decisions. The official story, the one Victor Lang, the Maple Ridge maintenance director, tried to sell the next day, was that their crew had come out with county-approved permits to inspect a culvert near our shared boundary, that there had been an unfortunate electrical issue with an old panel mounted on the barn wall, sparks, dry boards, high winds, the perfect storm, the kind of thing no one could have predicted. He said it all with a straight face while Charlotte stood beside him in a tasteful black coat, hands folded like she was at a funeral she'd organized. But the tape from Mark Harder's security camera, angled just right across the creek, told a different story. It showed Maple Ridge's crew unbolting the metal gate my father had installed, stepping well onto my side of the line, fiddling with an electrical panel they had no business touching, ignoring the flicker of arcing wires as they tried to tap into a feed, and when the first puff of smoke curled up from the wall, it showed them backing away, looking at the growing glow, then leaving no 911 call, no warning, just a quiet retreat while my family's history turned to coals. The barn wasn't just a building, it was where my grandfather had stored the tools he'd used to restore the orchard, where my father had kept boxes of artifacts entrusted to us by a tribal elder who didn't trust the county museum, where I'd carved my initials next to my brothers on a beam we weren't supposed to climb, and standing in the ash the next morning, crunching charred boards under my boots, I felt something inside me tear open, grief mixed with a rage so clean it almost felt like clarity. That clarity sharpened when the fire marshal quietly told me the county had no record of any active permit for Maple Ridge's crew to be on my property, when the sheriff's deputy mumbled that this looked bad but would take time to sort out, and when, as if on cue, Charlotte arrived again that afternoon, speaking in that soft, sympathetic tone people reserve for funerals and business negotiations, saying how heartbroken she was for me, how dangerous these old structures could be, and how, maybe, just maybe, the barn fire was a sign that it was time to move forward and consider a purchase offer from the HOA or one of their partner developers before the county came in and declared the property unsafe and condemned it. For a moment, I honestly thought I might hit her the way my hands shook at my sides, but instead I laughed this raw, humorless sound that scared even me and told her to get off my land, that if anyone was going to condemn anything around here, it wasn't going to be my ranch. 2 days later, sifting through the debris with Mark and Emily, trying to save anything that hadn't turned to dust, my shovel hit something that didn't sound like brittle wood or melted metal. It was a hard, dull thud, and when we cleared the ash away, there was a small fireproof lockbox, blackened on the outside but intact, the kind of thing my father would have hidden somewhere he thought no one would ever look until they had to. And inside we found exactly what he'd wanted me to see when everything else was gone. There were water rights documents older than my parents' marriage, detailed maps labeling the sacred spring as a protected cultural site, correspondence from the 70s and 80s between my grandfather and state land offices. But the thing that stopped my breath was a slim envelope with my name on it and a key taped inside, marked only with the words "Bank Vault. Use if they come back." In the vault, under the flickering fluorescent lights of a downtown branch I hadn't been in for years, the clerk brought out a flat metal box and set it on the table like it was nothing. But when I opened it, there were the original land grant documents for the entire Maple Ridge area, back when it had been nothing but fields and creeks, and on the last page, in dense legal language I knew how to read better than most, was a clause that looked like any other boilerplate paragraph until you really understood what it meant. The grant, the one that allowed Maple Ridge Estates to exist at all, was conditional, tied to a set of environmental and cultural protections that had to be certified every 20 years by the State Land Resources Division. It required that wetlands be preserved, that native species habitat not be destroyed, that cultural sites like springs and old orchard lines not be disturbed, and that at least 20% of the tract remain undeveloped open space. It also stated that if those conditions were violated, or if renewal was denied, remedial control could be shifted to the state, including authority to impose fines, revoke portions of the grant, or strip certain parcels of their status. And on the cover sheet someone, probably my grandfather, had scribbled one more piece of information: renewal due 30 days from now. I sat there in that little vault room for a long time, the weight of that date sinking in, because as of 3 years ago, my job title had changed. I'd been promoted, and my current role just happened to include serving as one of the primary reviewers for legacy land grant renewals in this region, including, as fate or irony or something larger would have it, the very grant Maple Ridge Estate sat on. The thing about power, real power, the kind that doesn't shout, is that it usually hides in boring paperwork nobody reads, in clauses and conditions tucked into dusty files, in signatures forgotten until someone digs them up again. And as I walked out of that bank, lockbox documents now in my own folder, ash still in the cuffs of my jeans, I realized Charlotte Whitmore had been fighting the wrong man. She'd picked a fight with a rancher, but she'd never bothered to ask what I did between 8 and 5, and now the clock was ticking on a game she didn't even know she was playing. So I did what I always do when something matters more than I can say out loud. I started building a case, spreadsheets and timelines, aerial maps showing filled-in wetlands where there should have been ponds, satellite images of trail expansions through areas marked as protected, internal HOA emails leaked by Victor Lang's furious ex-wife, showing surveillance cameras pointed illegally onto my property. And with the help of Sophia Klein from our own land office and Councilman Eric Barnes, who'd been quietly frustrated with Maple Ridge for years, I gathered enough evidence to make the phrase grant violation sound less like a threat and more like a sentence. By the time Judge Leonard Price, a man with a memory like a ledger, agreed to review some of the historical boundary disputes, an investigative reporter, Heather Blake for the Red Hawk Chronicle, started calling me back with questions that showed she understood just how deep this went. I knew the barn fire wasn't the end of something old. It was the spark that lit up the whole rotten structure they'd been standing on. The first official clash happened at what was supposed to be a simple condemnation hearing. Maple Ridge's attorneys had filed to have my ranch road and spring area declared unsafe and unsanitary, a clear prelude to cutting off access entirely. And I walked into that county chamber wearing a suit that still smelled faintly of smoke, my folder thick with every piece of truth they'd hoped would stay buried. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I just laid it all out. The fire marshal's report showing the electrical panel had been tampered with by Maple Ridge's crew, the camera footage of them on my land without permission, the violation letters built on a boundary line that didn't match the recorded plat, the secret HOA surveillance cameras pointed at my pasture, the fact that their environmental emergency barriers had rerouted runoff directly into the remnants of my orchard. And then, when the room was already humming with discomfort, I introduced something new, the existence of the original land grant and the little matter of a renewal deadline sitting inside my office at the state. You could feel the shift when Commissioner Alan Ruiz leaned forward, asked me to repeat the part about the cultural sites, the wetlands, the open space requirement, and then turned to the HOA's lawyer and asked very calmly if Maple Ridge Estates had ever disclosed to residents that their subdivision existed under a conditional grant that required compliance with environmental protections they were now very clearly ignoring. And when the attorney started to stammer something about historical documents, the commissioner announced he was suspending any condemnation action pending a full investigation into potential grant violations, effectively freezing Maple Ridge's plans in place. Heather Blake's article hit 2 days later, front page, with a photo of my charred barn and a headline that read something like "Luxury HOA accused of environmental fraud and cultural site encroachment." And from there, the story jumped to regional outlets, then to a state-level investigative program that loved the David versus Goliath angle. especially when the twist came out that the David in this story also held the pen that could sign off on the Goliath's land rights. The sheriff's office, which had been cautious at first, suddenly found their spine. Sheriff Daniels and Fire Chief Morales held a joint press conference stating that, while the barn fire may not have been a Hollywood arson plot, it was the result of deliberate negligence and unauthorized work by Maple Ridge's contractor, that their failure to call on the blaze immediately had contributed directly to the total loss, and that charges of reckless endangerment and property damage were being recommended against Victor Lang and referred to the DA. Meanwhile, at the state level, our enforcement division opened a formal land grant renewal review, and I recused myself from the final vote, but not before submitting a detailed report on every violation we'd uncovered. Filled wetlands replaced with decorative rock beds, walking trails cut through habitat corridors, a fancy overlooked deck perched so close to the sacred spring it might as well have been a stage. All of it documented in before and after photos, environmental assessments doctored by consultants who forgot to mention half the species in their survey. The grant renewal hearing was the closest thing I've ever seen to a courtroom in a conference room. On one side sat Charlotte, Victor, and Mayor Collins, who'd hitched his reputation to Maple Ridge's tax base. On the other side sat me, Mark and Emily, tribal representatives who'd been furious to learn their sacred site had been turned into a brochure backdrop. In a room full of residents who suddenly realized their HOA dues might now be used to pay for someone else's arrogance. The panel didn't revoke the grant entirely. That would have thrown hundreds of innocent homeowners into chaos. But they did something that hurt Maple Ridge's power far more surgically. They renewed the land grant under strict remediation conditions, imposed heavy fines, ordered the restoration of damaged wetlands and cultural buffers under state supervision, and, most importantly for me, they carved out Cole Ranch and the surrounding spring zone as officially exempt from all HOA influence, and designated it a protected heritage site beyond the reach of any future boundary games. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte Whitmore was indicted on charges related to fraudulent filings and misuse of HOA funds. Victor Lang took a plea deal on the fire case and agreed to testify about internal discussions where they'd gambled on pushing the rancher out. Mayor Collins resigned under pressure after emails surfaced showing he'd fast-tracked Maple Ridge's request despite staff objections. And the once unshakable HOA found itself facing an audit, a hemorrhaging budget, and a community of residents suddenly very interested in bylaws they'd never read before. When the dust settled in the legal sense, Charlotte ended up with a conviction, a short jail term with part of it suspended, a long probation, and a lifetime ban from serving on any governing board in the county. Victor lost his licenses and his job, and the old HOA structure collapsed under its own weight, replaced by a new association led by people like Emily and Ellen Ramirez, residents who care more about stewardship than status, who wrote new rules that actually protected both property rights and the land itself. As for me, my quiet work at the state didn't stay quiet for long. I was promoted to Director of Environmental Compliance and Heritage Lands, a title that sounded fancier than it felt. But it came with something I cared far more about than the pay bump, the chance to help other families who were being crushed under the heels of weaponized HOAs and corrupt local deals. I took a chunk of the settlement money from the fire case and set up a small legal aid fund so that the next rancher, the next widowed homeowner, the next person who thought they were alone in their fight, would have somewhere to turn. We rebuilt the barn, not as an exact replica, because you can't rebuild ghosts, but as a modern, sustainable structure that still honored the original footprint. We used reclaimed wood and steel, installed solar on the roof, left a corner inside as a little museum of what survived the fire, my grandfather's tools, charred but cleaned, a photograph of my father leaning against the old boards in 1982, tribal artifacts returned to us for safekeeping and displayed with permission and respect. Outside, we planted a young sapling grown from the last old apple tree that had clung to life near the ruin, and when it took root, I felt something in me finally do the same. On the day the heritage designation plaque was mounted near the sacred spring, the water still as clear and cold as it had been when I was a kid sneaking sips on hot days, I stood there with Mark and Emily, with tribal elders, with a few Maple Ridge residents who'd crossed the invisible line to say they were sorry, and I thought about how close all of this had come to disappearing under a walking path and a marketing slogan, erased by people who thought the only kind of value that mattered could be measured in property appraisals. Now, when I tell this story into a camera, when someone online hears about a rancher whose barn was burned and whose enemies didn't know he held their land grant in his hands, they always ask me if I think justice was done. If Charlotte going to jail, if the HOA collapsing, if the fines and the new rules and the shiny new barn make up for what was lost. And I never have a simple answer, because no court can sentence arrogance out of a human heart, and no settlement can replace a barn built by your great-grandfather's hands. But I do know this: the land is safer now than it was. The spring is protected. The community has changed its shape around a truth it can't ignore anymore. And the next time an HOA somewhere thinks they can redraw lines and torch someone's history without consequence, maybe they'll remember that power doesn't just sit in boardrooms and cul-de-sacs. It also lives in old documents and stubborn families, in people who decide they are done being quiet. So here's what I wrestle with, and maybe you will too. When a group of well-dressed bullies hides behind rules and letters and fancy titles to grind down one stubborn holdout, are we only responsible for saving our own fence line? Or do we owe something bigger, a duty to dig up the old truths, to fight back even when it hurts, to drag the whole rigged game into the light, so that the next time someone like me inherits a piece of history, they don't have to choose between peace and justice, just to keep what was already theirs?